So right around this point, it might seem like I've dragged you into a labyrinth and that there's no real way out of this. We are now 9 dilemmas into this, and it looks kind of hopeless. We're just deeper and deeper into these problems. But this lesson in particular is an interesting turning point. And it is actually more meta than usual. Now, we've already been pretty meta this whole time. But in this particular lesson, we're going to run into 2 problems that we've discussed before. And whereas before we simply discussed them, now we're running into them and engaging with them in a different way. So the first thing that I'll say is that all the way back in Unit 1, I sort of talked down to the educational system in this country and in other countries as well, in that I said the history of science has been oversimplified, and that is to our detriment, the detriment of our students. However, in this lesson, when I'm trying to tell the history of a particular science, it's going to feel like we're spinning plates. I mean, to tell the story as it really occurred is extremely challenging, and you have to hold all these views in your mind at the same time. It's, you understand why in K through 12 the history of science is oversimplified. The real story is just, it's too much. So that's one way in that this is kind of extra meta. Before we just looked at the problem, now we're in it. But here's a second way that this lesson is a little more meta than usual. So last time we met Escher's dragon biting its own tail. Well, we're actually doing something similar. This class now is sort of coming full circle, and it's facing some of the same problems that we began with. So you might have thought that we're really far away from those problems. We're 9 dilemmas away from them, to be precise. But actually, they crop up again, like all we did is made a giant circle. Well, that may or may not be the case. I don't want to spoil the fun yet. But it is, again, peculiar. Escher's dragon here being an interesting representation of what's going on here. So what's going on right now is that we're moving towards answering the question, attempting to answer the question. If machines can be intelligent, or more ambitiously, if machines can be conscious. So that's the ball you have to keep your eye on, right? So that's what we're moving towards. And in order to get there, we will have to tell you the story of cognitive science, since it's, I think pretty illustrative of some of the problems that surround attempting to answer those questions. Well, quick recap here. Last time we began by covering a view called dualism. I'm calling it here Cartesian dualism. It's, the Descartes variety of dualism. And, it's not looking great for dualism. Modern research does not really focus on attempting to figure out, like Descartes tried, to see how the soul interacts with the body via the pineal gland. That's just not what's going on anymore. That does not mean that things are, all rainbows and lollipops for the opposing camp, the materialists. They are mired in debates. The materialists, here's one kind, the behaviorists, they can't agree on what a mental state is or what a mental process is. So we had one view, we kind of focused on the behaviorists, and they are no longer the favorite. We also looked at identity theory, and that is also no longer the favorite. We ended up with machine functionalism. Now, if you don't fully understand functionalism, that's totally okay. Today is about functionalism. We're picking up that strand today. And we won't even end with functionalism. Let me just say this much right now. They're not going to be the favorite by the end of next lesson either. So we'll get to that when we get to it. Let's not talk about it yet. So let's now focus on a little bit of history. The history of a field, cognitive science. And it's only about 60 years old, at least at the time of this recording. And it is, I think, a very interesting field. And functionalism plays an important role in its inception. So that's why we're picking up this story here. So let's begin with a definition. Cognitive science is an interdisciplinary approach to the study of the mind and its functions. It usually consists of philosophy, psychology, neuroscience, linguistics, anthropology, computer science, and artificial intelligence, but can include other disciplines. Some other disciplines that, it's not unheard of that they play a role in cog sci are, for example, evolutionary game theory or any kind of more mathematized biological approaches. Those end up in cog sci. Also economics, behavioral economics, even classical economics. So there's a lot of overlap here. And if you enter one of the very few programs in cognitive science, there's not that many programs still, but you end up studying all these things. And it's I think it's a very well-rounded program. I think it's fantastic. I'll just say that. Okay. Cog sci is one of the many, many ripples that Alan Turing had across intellectual domains. Alan Turing, for someone who tragically died in his 40s, it's fascinating that he had such an impact. He's the modern father of computer science, and he's several things are named after him in the theory of computation. Obviously a pioneer of artificial intelligence, was a war hero. He helped crack the Nazi Enigma code and helped the Allied war effort. And of course, his ideas were influential in the founding of cognitive science. So, this guy was truly an exceptional thinker. And he's sort of the hero of this class. We're only focusing on his influence on cognitive science, but just know that Turing is, kind of an important figure in the history of sort of intellectual history generally. That's how big of a deal he is. Okay, so let's go through some of this history. Turing introduces a concept of what would eventually be called a Turing machine in 1936, and less than a decade later, in 1943, Warren McCulloch and Walter Pitts were the first to suggest that something resembling a Turing machine might provide a good model for the mind. McCulloch there pictured. Of course, Turing machines were being used as a concept all over the place. A Turing machine is simply an idealized computational mechanism. Basically, it's a model of how to compute things. And so this was obviously important in developing computers, digital computers, as well as you're going to see, people were using this for other things too. Maybe it's a good model for the mind, McCulloch thought. So this concept, of course, being spread out very widely. It's very important to note the following. Around this time, the U.S. government and others were investing heavily in radical new technologies, including nuclear energy and computer science. So in this book, Matsukato is making the case that this idea that the public sector is inefficient is simply false. Now, if you want something a little less politically loaded, that's fine. Take a look at these histories of computing and physics, respectively, there simply is no question about the following. The middle of the 20th century was the era of big science. It just is the case that the government, and let's just focus on the US government for now, they funded research in computer science, they funded research in physics, they propped up and funded computer science departments across universities in the country. There were already physics departments, but the amount of money that the state gave to physicists during the 20th century, it's sort of baffling, right? I mean, you don't get a large hadron collider, for example, without vast sums of government money. So it just is the era of big science, of government-funded science. Even though it was always funded by the government, it really got ratcheted up during this time period. And importantly, at least with regards to computing, none of these, basically the market for computing devices wouldn't exist without the government having literally made the that whole market ecosystem. They funded the research, they funded the departments, training in computation, etc., etc. So this is very important to understand that. Now, it's not like the government was doing this out of the goodness of its heart. They were trying to at first win a war and then win a Cold War. So let me take this from the slides. Jim Holt reminds us that the digital universe and the hydrogen bomb were brought into existence at the same time by the same people. In fact, the first task of MANIAC 1 was to do the calculations for the hydrogen bomb. MANIAC, by the way, being a supercomputer. So this is, I mean, you know, that's what governments do. They protect their interests, and one of their interests is to win wars, right? So during World War II, of course, the Manhattan Project was initiated. That's when big physics kind of took off, you know, big physics funded by the government in grand ways, millions of dollars. And of course, the computations were getting so tough that after Turing had his ideas, they had to build computers, right? So so that they can do the computations for the bombs. And so that's the other reason why they funded computation. So it needs to be understood that it was the government, but it's not like they did it so that you can have Twitter and all that. I mean, they did it to win wars. Okay. So with all that said, by the 1960s, now 2 decades or so into the era of big science, the field of cognitive science was emerging, and central to this field was the notion that the mind is a Turing machine. This is otherwise known as the classical computational theory of mind. I typically abbreviate that as CCTM. In 1986, fun fact, the University of California, San Diego opened the first cognitive science department in the world, I might add. And interestingly, that same year, a classic paper on backpropagation was published. Now, if you don't know what backpropagation is, that's okay. If you do know, kudos. That'll be relevant next time. So just know that these things are all parallel. That's why it's so hard to tell these stories. All these things are happening at the same time. So, okay. The classical computational theory of mind, CCTM, is the view that the mind is fundamentally a computing system, a Turing machine, in other words. Now, this finally brings us back to functionalism. This is where we left off last time. Functionalism is the view that what makes something a mental state has nothing to do with what it is made out of, but rather has to do with the role that it plays in the system of which it is a part. Its functional organization is the way that I like to kind of summarize all that. So, what is this view? Well, second recap, just so that it's really, really, really clear. We had this whole battle, right? I mean, dualism gave way, well, dualism gave way to materialism. There was already materialism a long, long time ago, but dualism was pretty dominant. Behaviorism became dominant, skipping a lot, right? Mind-brain identity then became kind of popular. Functionalism then, became the dominant view after mind-brain identity theory. So we've already told that story. But functionalism, all that functionalism really is, it's a view about, let me get rid of that. It's a view about what a mental state is. But CCTM, the classical computational theory of mind, that's a view about what mental processes are. So you're actually allowed to combine them, and in fact, that's what Hilary Putnam did. He took CCTM, he took functionalism, and that's how you get machine functionalism, which I sometimes refer to computationalism because some people call it that, that's why. So that's what this view is, all right? Now, just so that you know, we have to really break these views down so you can really see what's going on. So there's two questions. I want to be clear about this. There's a question of what are mental states, and there's a question of what are mental processes. What is essentially the kind of functioning that the mind does? What sort of mechanics does it follow? So, functionalism is a view about what mental states are, namely, the view that mental states are functional states, organizational states. That's what functionalism is. It's about what mental states are. CCTM is a view about what mental processes are, namely the view that mental processes are computations. So one is about states, what is a mental state? The other one is about processes, what's a mental process? And so that's how you get machine functionalism. You take a view about what mental processes are and what mental states are, and you get machine functionalism. So with that said, I just want to show you that you actually don't have to combine CCTM with functionalism. I mean, there's actually a very famous theory, the representational theory of mind, RTM, that also gets combined with CCTM, and it doesn't have a cool name like machine functionalism. I'm just going to call it CCTM plus RTM. So, I mean, in other words, some people think that, that's the only rational combination. No, there's other ones. I'm not really going to focus on RTM. I'll tell you a brief history because it ties in with something else. So it's actually Jerry Fodor who advocated this view. So let me take it from the slides. Jerry Fodor advocated a version of CCTM combined with what he called the representational theory of mind, where the attention is shifted to the symbols manipulated during Turing-style computation. In fact, Fodor is reviving an old view, which stretches back at least to William of Occam's Summa Logica, where Occam argues that thinking occurs in a language of thought, sometimes called mentalese, right, like Chinese mentalese. This is a view from Occam. It seems like it might go back further. I personally don't, I don't see it. I think it's pretty original to Occam. So we've been talking about propositions, the thought behind a declarative sentence. Well, that thought is in the language of thought. It's in mentalese, right? Or it's in brainish. That's another thing they call it, brainish, like English, brainish. So in any case, that's what Fodor is advocating, Occam's language of thought. So let's get back into this theory real quick. Combining RTM with CCTM, Fodor argues that mental activity involves Turing-style computation over the language of thought. So this language of thought, which has meaning already built into it, all mental activity is computing over those already defined notions. And he has his own theory as to how we acquire them. Let me just say this, because we're not really focusing on this view here, but Fodor isn't alone in supposing that there is a language of thought, although that doesn't necessarily mean that people like Pinker here agree with CCTM plus RTM, but at least some people think there is something to this language of thought. So in any case, That is the story of why functionalism, in particular machine functionalism, is relevant to us. It basically was the next dominant view that literally was part of the inception of an entire field, cognitive science. So that's the little history that I need to tell you. And cognitive science eventually ended up fighting with another field, cognitive neuroscience. Now, if you thought they were the same thing, you'd be forgiven. No, they basically are. But there was some pretty hostile debates early on, and I tell you about those last time. What is important for us here is that you understand machine functionalism, because in the 1980s, right around the same time, right, that UCSD was opening up their cog-sci department, there emerged a prominent rival to classical computationalism. And you're going to see that story, hear that story, well, soon.